Good afternoon. Um, I'm Paul O'Brien, and welcome to this sustainability webinar. Um, it's an unusual webinar in that um, I'm going to look at the sustainability from an overall perspective to some extent, and it's really provoked by recent comments on failures to achieve certain things, probably based on the Paris promises, if you like, and some criticism. Anytime a report is issued, certainly in our experience here in Ireland, there's criticism what isn't being achieved. And I thought, from a global perspective, there is an awful lot being achieved, and you never hear that, or at least I don't hear it in the world that I'm living in. And just to give you an idea, in my career, I spent a career in industry early on with experience in the oil and gas industry, the paper and pulp sector, and eventually the electrical industry before I relaxed into the risk and sustainability world. Uh, but the whole issue of process has been something that I've been passionate about over the years, and what I'm listening to is people describing process failures. And in my head, the commitments made in Paris were somewhat speculative. They were very, very hopeful. They were, in some cases, dependent on technologies that didn't exist. They were potentially envisaged, and some that were so embryonic that they were, almost they were far-fetched in some cases. And yet, the general belief at the Paris COP meeting was that yeah, we have to do something, and that was reinforced. And they made the assumptions that they would have these technologies to make whatever happened over the period, the span of the 5 years intervening. So really, what I wanted to do today is to take a look and say that there have been successes. I'm fundamentally an optimist. And I believe there have been successes, and I think that we are going to achieve the targets. I'm thinking about the 2050 goal particularly rather than the intermediate ones, but I believe we're going to get there. So what I'd like to do is just take um, 35 minutes or so to share some of, first of all, some of the research that we've done just to see how is the global situation on a lot of this stuff, and to just share some of that data. One of the things you'll find is right through it, there's a lot of references, and we will put the links to the various pieces of information that we share today on a slide at the back and circulate that when we go out with the slide deck. It's unusual, but sit back and take as much of it in as you can. There's an opportunity to ask questions. Do put them in the chat. I'm not sure I'd be able to answer them, but certainly we'll have a look, and it might inform further discussions down the road. I hope you stay with me. So we're going to look at the global context a little bit, and then what I describe as the reduction equation, which is really the challenge that came from the agreements that were made. The challenge is enormous. Um, but in some areas, the pace of the clean technology deployment is faster and going better than what it was anticipated. Going to have a look at the key sources of emissions, and we're going to look at some case studies, some of the ones that have had difficulty and some of the ones that are succeeding. And then we look at some innovation from different places and in some cases with new technologies. And we conclude with just a kind of an overview of where we think we're at. But in order to set context, a lot of talk about the industrial era. So what I just put here is the population growth, and this tracks from 1.1 billion in 1800 all the way out to 8.2 billion in 2025. So this is kind of a context statement. And then I went and mapped and looked at the atmospheric CO2 concentration over the same period. So you can see a certain correlation here. This is parts per million. of CO2 in the atmosphere. Now, I know that all the greenhouse gases come to the totality of the problem we're trying to solve, but for the purposes of this and for the purposes of keeping my own head straight on this, I tend to have the CO2 equivalent and use those numbers. But against the rising population, you can see that the emission, part per million emissions in the atmosphere have also risen. I'm not suggesting that they're directly correlated, but there is certainly some correlation with the industrial development and the use of fossil fuels by mankind. Now, in this, I'm going to refer to a number of international organizations that are doing rankings, and I just picked this one because I've used this one before. Underlying Paris and the agreement with all the focus on the emissions and the concentration on the emissions and how we're going to solve those problems, there is what I describe as a fairness agenda. And this particular index includes the governance and the social aspects of that fairness agenda, as well as the environmental aspects. And it's a very good, I've used it before for those of you who've been on some of these webinars in the past. I've used it before, and it gives an indication of a kind of a ranking, and there's a rating and a ranking, and it's color coded. And one of the things that they do is they don't assign any country with the first three slots. So basically, they start at number four, and you can see the ones that are there or thereabouts. And some of them are unusual. Some of you think, wow, you could understand why certain ones are there, but it's hard to see. For example, Chile wouldn't come immediately to you, nor indeed with its vast population, the most populous country in the world, with India. But nonetheless, they're up there in this ranking. Worth a look. And I say the links to these are there, and this is part of the fairness agenda, the ESG side of it. We'll talk a little bit more about that later on. Okay, so this one is another. It's a link that looks at carbon emissions per capita. Now, again, part of the fairness agenda. And if you look at it, particularly if you look at sub-Saharan Africa, one of the things that is obvious, I suppose, in the color coding is just the issues in terms of emissions that they're effectively negligible in sub-Saharan Africa. But one of the things statistically, and this research and this webinar has caused us to look at an awful lot of statistics. 8% of the world population still does not have access to electricity. And most of those people are in sub-Saharan Africa. And this kind of bears that out. So the fairness agenda and the work that's being done, particularly in the energy sector, needs to address that. And that's part of the big picture, if you like. So the second section here I'm going to look at is the CO2 reduction equation. There's basically three issues here. From a process perspective, you stop putting the carbon dioxide and other gases into the atmosphere. That will cause a reduction. Start taking it out, which basically is things that we'll talk about later on in technologies about capturing the carbon from the atmosphere. And then the third thing that needs to be considered is hold it in manageable form. So some of the holding would happen when you stop taking it out, and some of it will happen when you have taken it from the atmosphere and you've got to put it somewhere. That is basically the fundamentals of sequestration. Where the emissions come from, this particular one is a 24 set of data, but in you're looking at the 57.7 gigatons. There's so many noughts in some of these figures that it becomes, well, a little bit mind-boggling, but basically it's a lot. And it's looked at generally in 5-year terms. The 2025 data, these same data, that has now gone up to just over 60 billion tons. So it's it's significant. And the sources here, primary source is energy, um, and the second biggest source is uh, transport. And basically, you're talking about vehicular transport. You're also talking about aviation here. You're talking about the mix of heavy goods vehicles, marine transport, all of that put into that box. Again, you could study it in great detail. I'm going to pick a few of those when we get into the deeper solution end of what we're going to talk about today. Um, You've got things like fuel production, buildings, and industrial processes. Generally, some of those are using electricity, some of them are using chemicals. Um, the One of the other big ones, and probably the most amongst the most stubborn, is the agriculture and land use change. Those two particularly because they're associated with employment and they're associated with food security. Um, there are there are, I suppose, hard spots in those spaces. Waste is again a significant contributor, so we can take a look at some of that as well. Basically, what we're looking at here is international organizations that are doing the counts. So these people have responsibility to government responsibility primarily to the UN to gather these data. So the data is reliable, and as I said earlier on, it's all sourced, and we will give you access to the sources. In fact, some of them we've actually left the source data at the in the slides, but we'll give you access to it as a collective. So they're your sources, and this is not a rogues gallery. There are some nations that are still growing their total emissions, and this was in part envisaged in their commitments. China is the biggest emitter, as much of its energy is generated using coal still. By far the worst of the fossil fuels is coal. The emissions growth has slowed, and it's a trade-off with many moving parts. But China is by far the biggest investor in wind and solar renewable projects and tree planting, and that's in the world. They are investing in that. So they are aware of their issue here, and they're very, very committed to reducing it. They're approaching a tipping point. The data we're reading would suggest that within 3 years they probably will stop growing their emissions. And also, you have to remember China is the world's largest producer of solar panels and associated equipment. So basically, they are um, manufacturing for the world in certain things, and those things are the things that are benefiting a lot of the reduction that's happening in all places. India is in a similar position. These data should be considered in light of the nation's population. India's emissions are growing by comparison, for example, with the United States, but India has a population that's nearly 4 times that of the United States. So their starting point would have been different. So you have to consider that as part of the whole fairness equation when you look at these data. As I said, it's not a rogues gallery. It's just an indication of where we're at. Oh, okay. I put this in for a reason because one of the things that often, when you hear the word failure, um, usually what's missing is the understanding of where you're coming from, where your starting point is. So I put this in 1903. Wilbur Wright and his brother made the first flight. And by contrast, the aviation sector made some very, very strong commitments. And one of the most, I say, I'm going to call it, I use the word hardest. One of the hardest plans that was put down was by IATA, was by basically the aviation sector. And they envisaged an awful lot of things. And in envisaging that stuff, they made assumptions that they would achieve the net zero by 2050. And that was built into the plan. But just to give you some idea, It continues to grow globally, so basically the emissions numbers are going up. And one of the things about aviation emissions is that represents about 4% of the, well, sorry, back off. The CO2 part of it represents about 2.5% of the global emissions annually. But aviation, particularly because of where it does the emitting, if you like, in fuel terms up in the upper atmosphere, is also high level of the other gaseous emissions. So the nitrous oxides and the other greenhouse gases are there in significant numbers, and that could make or would make by expert evaluation about 4%. So the 2.5% becomes about 4% when you add the other gases in that particular area. But then you have to look at what happens in the real world. So the production, the things that were envisaged to happen when the Paris Agreement and the IATA commitments were made haven't happened. First one was the shutdown of COVID, and the second one was regional wars, some of which we're regionally experiencing. The other one was the grounding of the 30-day Max Boeing Max 737. These aircraft would have been far more sustainable, if you like, in real terms than the ones that they were going to replace. And the whole Boeing thing slowed production down, we know. And the other thing is the availability of sustainable aviation fuel, or SAF. So those kind of headwinds came against the aviation sector in its totality, and it impacted that plan. One of the things that, sorry, one of the things that happened here was um, when that impact began to go public, if you like. Air New Zealand was the first one to come out with its hands up and said, "Listen, we're not going to make this." And they were very honest about it. They explained why they weren't going to make the 2030 and the 2050 commitments. And if anybody is interested in it, and it is worth reading, there is an article and there's a link to the article at the end of the webinar in that slide. It's a Guardian article about the Air New Zealand's explanation of where they were at, and it's well worth reading because what you're looking at is a series of envisaged projects that didn't happen. It's not that they're not going to happen, but they didn't happen in the timeline that was anticipated at the time the promises were made. And when you hear about people talking about failures, and usually these are people who are at the edge of the game and not in the middle of it, it's very simple to point to a failure. I mean, here in Ireland, we have things like we have a hospital, children's hospital that's been built in Dublin, and continuously every couple of months you hear about the latest failures of the contractor. But the thing is, the timeline becomes impossible because when the project starts to go wrong, it's very easy to point a finger and blame, but the reality is the devil is in the detail here, and that is the case with the aviation sector. And one of the things they do for the operating ones, in order to show improvement, what they're doing is they have put what they call an intensity metric in. And I'm always fascinated with that intensity metric. I think it's actually very, uh, because it relates to the region the airline exists, which is the passenger. And then it looks to their input in terms of the aligning the carbon emissions with the passenger. So what they do basically is they have an intensity metric that is the grams of CO2 per passenger per kilometer traveled. And yeah, they've got that. So if one airline does improve its position by buying new aircraft or improve its position by adding a percentage of sustainable aviation fuel, they can make those numbers go down and they can see them going down. Where otherwise, it's very, very difficult to do that. Okay, it's one, and the link is worth a read. Um, okay, section four. What's happening in energy? And this is probably the most active space, and the evidence of our eyes is that there's a lot going on here. So these are headlines to give you some idea of what is happening and has been happening over a period. Some of these are the I suppose the big winners in here are EVs and the deployment of EVs, and we'll talk about timelines in a minute with these things. The other is the solar panels and the solar generation and the speed at which that has accelerated and is deployed, and wind energy. And wind is like the I'm going back to my aircraft analogy, and we'll talk a little bit about that uh, as we when we get to it. But we'll run some stats on these things just to show you where it's at. This is a graphic that Catherine did here to try and bring this all into one place. So if you're looking for good news, look at these numbers, look at these headline numbers. And obviously, this is a today uh, shot at where we're at. Uh, and if you look at any one of them, you've got to say, yeah, we're making progress. There's no failure here. There may be failures locally, there may be minor trivia things that have been delayed, there may be this, that, and the other thing, but these are very serious, very big numbers that are showing progress on some of, I'm saying some of the major projects that are going on and were designed and were talked about and were agreed. And some of the things that are causing those to happen are well worth looking at. So look at wind, and we go back as far as the Greeks, I think, for the first one, the the uh, the first windmill. But basically, wind energy, harvested wind energy, associating the wind and the rotary motion that was possible to get from wind and turning that into something that made electricity. That basically is almost run on the principle of an old water wheel that used to do the grinding or whatever of corn, whatever the old water wheels were used for. So basically, look at the timeline. So not dissimilar to the Wright brothers, around about the same time. Then the development went hand in hand. The first three-bladed went on the older ones. The older ones had more blades, and you still see some of those, particularly in rural America, where they use them for wells and they use them for pumping. You see some of those old windmills with the tail at the back. They're out there, some of those still. And then in the 1980, this triggered, if you look at the size, 30 kilowatt each in the first wind farm. And that basically started an industry. And where has it gone? Well, two things have happened. First of all, the volume. We'll deal with the volume in a minute. But this chart shows what's on top of the windmill. So what's happened in the growth of the megawatt output of a single unit. And in any engineering terms, to have a 14 megawatt generator on top of a pole in the middle of an ocean with three wings on it is just phenomenal. And the technology and the people, the engineers, the manufacturers who are behind that, and there are many of them, the people who install and maintain them, they see is phenomenal. The fact that they can get there. I put it in context. Ireland's first serious power station was in Arna-Crossia, and it was built by the German engineers in 1927 to 1929. It was 84 megawatt. So basically, six of these turbines now would replace that, or the equivalent to that. It's unbelievable if you consider what that did. It built a 15-kilometer canal down to a 91-foot drop in a river, run of the river generator. Phenomenal number of people working on it, all sorts of things. You can now go out and pop six of these on a bank somewhere where it's shallow enough in the sea and get the same output. Anyway, I'm fascinated by the technology, as you can see. So it's clean electricity. It is virtually zero. Now, I know in any of these conversations, first of all, I'm an optimist. I keep saying that I'm an optimist. In any of these conversations, you're going to have people who say, oh, but look at what it takes to get them and make them and all the rest of it. Yeah, okay, but we have to take action and we have to. I know the life cycle issue is something that we would calculate and we would be concerned about in terms of responsibility for emissions that we're involved with. But at the same time, these technologies have to exist in order to cause other technologies to be obsolete. And the particular one that we're after is the use of fossil fuel to generate electricity, and particularly the use of coal to generate electricity. So obviously these have that resilience issue in that when the wind doesn't blow, the ship doesn't go. So nothing happens if these things, if there isn't wind to power them. So you have to have the dependency today on the currently on the fossil fuel until that can be effectively replaced. And nor is enough redundancy in the grids to be able to carry the load when the wind isn't blowing and when these aren't generated. But when they are generated, you've got this secondary issue is that there's an awful lot of spilled energy as a result because there's nowhere to put it. They'll make more energy than the world can cater for or the networks can distribute to. Yeah, it's that dilemma continues. And these things operate in incredibly difficult conditions, but they are phenomenal pieces of technology. Now, they didn't happen automatically. And one of the things that you have to bear in mind here in the back of this, and these are part of the Paris commitments made by government, there is support for these. Now, and to some extent, there's grant support, there's encouragement for the development, and there's a refit rate, which is basically a guaranteed price for the output. These things are all necessary in order to cause these to be here. None of this technology would happen if it wasn't commercial. The commerciality is a very important part of the success. And these, particularly the companies who put the wind farms in, the companies who build the turbines, the guys who maintain and service them, and the guys who are planning for their continuance and their continuous maintenance over time. These have a shelf life in that the hostile environments they're in, they will need to be replaced and maintained, and there needs to be a cycle. That commerciality is important to be guaranteed. And it is, and that's where government support and taxpayer support is going in to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that. Just a number. The number of utility scale turbines worldwide over a period of 25 years. This is phenomenal. There are 400,000 utility scale turbines in operation today that weren't there 20, 30 years ago. I suppose my point with this is success. And anybody who chooses to throw failure darts at the energy sector on the climate uh, roadmap, if you like, I have problems with them. Look at this. Okay, if you want to talk about the biggest success of the lot, here it is. Now, very hard to fully quantify it, but I'm going to draw your attention in this chart to the end. Uh, so you're looking at the the baseline here was incandescent lighting was the baseline. And this chart was done, and the idea behind it was that it was a cost comparison primarily. But at the end of it, it talked a little bit about um, the kilograms reduction from the baseline as a result of the invention and the deployment of the LED lighting. Now, the extraordinary thing about this is, first of all, the depth of change. And if you look at the average bulb purchase cost at £5 in this example, you think it's probably an expensive bulb. But now look across at the life cycle. And I can tell you from my own experience, I have one of these, a G10 by a company called EcoPal that I would have bought in 2009. And it's burning continuously since, and it's still exactly the same as it was the first day I put it in. So the movement to LEDs from incandescent lighting in emissions terms is phenomenal. And just to give you an idea of the timeline, is the speed at which the transition happens. The economic logic in cost saving makes the payback period very short in real terms. And the life of the lifespan of the LED makes it, as I say, with the figure here, 5,000 hours, phenomenal. The decision became very simple. In 2000, the year 2000, incandescent light bulbs dominated the global market with 80 to 90%. The other 10%, 10% was basically linear CFLs, long tube CFLs. LEDs had less than 2% of the market at the time. In 2020, LEDs had grown to 48%. And today they're over 75% of the global market. So basically, the other bulb types are no longer manufactured. They're fading away, and people have got moved over to the LED. And the emissions benefit as a result of that transition has been phenomenal. They're looking at it's about I'm going to go back to the numbers, 8 to 900,000 tons of saved emissions as a result of that transition, and obviously the financial benefit of it as well. So that's one of the biggest successes, and a lot of these, in fact, probably I'm going to say most of the LED production in the world is in China. So that's why I say there's no rogues. It's not a rogues gallery with the Chinese with the manufacturing. Whether you agree or disagree with them, the way that the global manufacturing has gone, the fact that the volume output of these things to dominate the market to reduce the emissions globally is a worthy enterprise. So yeah, great success here. Okay, now we got to the rogue of the lot. Not really the rogue, I suppose, because we have a very high dependency on coal-fired power stations. Still, not a lot to say here. What this chart is showing is the difference between and I'm looking over here at the pounds per, uh, and this is the pound. This is American data. It's pounds per kilowatt hour of emissions. And if you look at the second line here, the natural gas emissions, more than half of the emissions from coal. So coal is very significant in its emissions, and the emissions are not just CO2, but the CO2 equivalent is what we look at. But it represents 9 billion. Coal-powered generation represents 9 billion. Now remember, we're talking about a total of 60 billion here this year, or 2025. Coal represents 9 billion annual tons of emissions. So it's significant in terms of what we do with that, and the ambition to reduce it. A lot of the European coal-fired power stations have been closed. We closed the last one. There's none in Ireland. There's none still in the UK. A couple of things happen with them. They either convert them to oil and use them as reserves. So basically, they bring them up only when the grid needs them. So when the max demand is on, and maybe when the wind isn't blowing or the sun isn't shining. Nowadays, when the renewables aren't available, they'll bring those reserve power stations up. And some of them they convert to natural gas. When they convert to natural gas, the emissions reduction is is very significant, and they can run them freely in tandem with the renewables. So there is an ambition to reduce to get rid of them, obviously, not possible in certain places, and yes, but at the same time across Europe, most of them at this stage have been closed. Um, just here, because they're interesting, I'd say from the point of view of their significance in terms of emissions. We'll put this link in here, and basically it is you can look at this link, and when you go into the website, you can basically, I'm not going to turn it on here because I'm terrified to do it in the middle of a webinar. I might not be able to get back to the slide deck. But basically, you can track the years, I think from 1920 all the way. You can track the world, uh, the view of coal generation across the world over time. It is, as I said, when talking about the Chinese one, it's beginning to turn. So basically, very close now to the point where they're still building them, they're still adding them, but they're also retiring them. So we think the number of coal-fired power stations is probably at its maximum now, and it will over time begin to tail off. Okay, I'm going to look at the EV global fleet, and this is another one of the successes. Um, the uh, this is numbers. So if you look down the side, you're looking at millions, 570 million are expected to be in the global EV fleet by 2035. And if you look at what's happened since 2015, this building number is significant. There are 50,000 at the end of 2025, 50 million at the end of 2025. It's expected to be 77 million at the end of 2026. And as I said, rising over the next 9 years to a total of 500 and 570 million. So the issue here is that when you put forecasts into these things, I suppose the promises of Paris envisaged this, and it would have had probably government leaders suggesting what they thought might happen, and maybe advised by some industry experts. What you're looking at here is the car manufacturers putting together their predictions for what their factories will output. And those car manufacturers will have a very, very serious and very real view of what they will be putting into the market each of those years. So this is real data, this is happening, and this will be a very significant conversion and reduction in emissions. Um, I put this up, and some of you who have listened to these webinars before will be familiar with it. This is battery energy storage system, and what it does is uh, it makes the utility. This is utility scale storage. What it makes does is it makes the utility more resilient and more reliable. So I suppose the best example of it is the last summer, the Spanish network blacked out and it pulled down some of the French network with it. And that basically was a knock-on effect of one particular um, solar field going offline. It didn't have enough storage, there wasn't enough capacity, or there wasn't enough time for the rest of the grid to respond to the dropout. But if this system was in place, that would not have happened. This is like a big buffer. They're beginning to be deployed at utility scale around the world. It was one of these things that was invented probably a very short time ago. And in truth, they're beginning to proliferate and get some idea of the scale there. Um, and you'll begin to see them usually where you've got a very big solar panel field. You'll see that these units are there. You often see them turning up in utility substations as well now because they basically keep they can carry the load for a certain time while the engineers get an opportunity to fix anything that's gone wrong. Okay, this is another one. This is an emerging technology, very much an emerging technology. And what this is, I'm now done onto the sequestration. This is what they call direct air capture. And what you're looking at here is the number of plants that are being built around the world and some of the scale. So these expect, the green ones, they expect to have operational in 2025. So this was the Wright brothers 2 years ago. This is really, really, really new technology. It's a combination of high pressure mechanical equipment combined with a chemical process. And what it does is basically it takes the carbon dioxide out of the air, turns it into a liquid form, compresses it, brings it to high pressure, and part of the process is to sequester it by injecting it back into the ground. So these are this process at the end of the day, and by the way, it is for the most part been driven by US oil companies. So you will see the deployment is for the most part in the US. And what they're doing is they're putting the carbon back into the oil wells. And so what it is you can now look at this as a carbon sink. So if you're thinking about offsets, if you can't reduce your carbon emissions and you've got down to the very end, this would be, could be, should be, together with all the other things that are being developed to sequester carbon, this is one of the things that will be very useful in the offsetting, the world of offsetting. Some organizations, particularly talked about the aviation sector, will inevitably have to get to offset in order to get to net zero. But the objective would be to squeeze as much as you can out of your current emissions profile, and then the residual purchase offsets and invest in offsets to get you to net zero. This is one of the technologies, emerging technologies, that is like to facilitate that in a big way. Um, couldn't go without putting nuclear in there somewhere. So this is just a link again to it's the nuclear industry. It's where they are. It goes through their capacity, the amount of power they generate, and it'll take you through the number of them. Fundamental technologies, nuclear technologies, obviously, the world is still very, very nervous about it. You can see that the second largest in the world is France. And a company called EDF, Electricity de France, would be significant in the UK, it's significant in France. They have an awful lot of nuclear power stations, and they're involved in the development of nuclear power stations as advisors, and indeed as investors in a number of countries around the world. Nuclear, as far as if you want to watch one, Hinkley Point in the UK is one in build. They're expecting to have it open sometime in the early 2030s. Well worth looking at. It was one of the biggest concrete pours in the world. I do know that. It's the third set of nuclear reactors that have been built on the site. The other ones were obsolete and they moved, so they keep reusing the site because it has the facility and the capability of doing that. Very good nuclear engineers in the UK. There hasn't been that much investment or building in new facilities there for some time, but Hinkley Point is one. It's in the Bristol Channel that is currently very active. Okay, so to the other success, and I'm conscious of time here, and I probably have overshot this. Solar panel technology, the advance is just phenomenal. The production rates are phenomenal. Um, it's an alternative. It's cleaner. It's deployable on your home roof. It's deployable at scale in large farms. It's deployable. It's just tremendous. One of the things that I'm trying to remember when I was putting this together is there was a guy from Mayo in Ireland who was involved in the latter stages of the development of these things, and he wound up with a process that allowed them to print solar panels. And that I don't know, I must find his name and see if he's still involved. Anyway, you know something about it. The graph will be there, but look at this, and this is gigawatt capacity, gigawatts capacity in 2025. This is real, this is out there. When the sun is shining, this is currently generating renewable electricity. Look at the growth from 2010. This is a 15-year growth cycle. The technology, go back to my Wright brothers, the technology was developed, the technology was improved, the process of manufacture was developed, the process was improved, and now these things are deployed at scale in volume all over the world. Huge success. There's no failure associated with this. Okay. Um, we just put this together to talk a little bit about the successes, if you like, solar capacity. Um, I have blown away every prediction. Uh, the it's just phenomenal. The cost reductions incurred, you know yourself from just watching the ads. Every time they've done an iteration, the costs come down. The cost has come down. It's become competitive to put them in place at industrial scale, at domestic scale. And look at it, it's just one of those huge successes. And anybody who's done it will find that ultimately there's payback. Again, you have to support where refit rates are agreed. It's been incentivized. There's the same as EVs, by the way, a lot of government incentives. Those things work. They happen and they matter. And they adjust them to try and drive some of these key things so there's none of them in failure, and that each of the countries where the government supports these initiatives tends to be participating, if you like. And we're fortunate in Ireland, the UK, and Europe for the most part that these incentives to market entry and incentives to customers to buy these things are supported. Um, Questions, if there are any? I don't know. Apologies for taking so long here. Have we any questions? No questions. Is there anybody? I'm sorry. I don't have any open questions. Okay. I don't know why that is, but listen, we'll happily share all of the material and just before we go here, I want to move on to what we've upcoming. So one of the things that we've been talking about lately is financed emissions. So we're going to do a webinar on financed emissions. We're also going to do a webinar on the calculation of the output of solar panels, including the the exported power, and how you can gather the how you can gather the benefit, if you like, of the solar panel energy that you sell. And then we're also looking at a webinar on the fully automated business travel calculator. So that's it. Sorry for taking so long, and I just move on to confirm that we will send out the source data for all of the stuff that we talked about today. I hope you've got something from it. I hope you've got a belief that, yeah, there is success out there, that we are making real progress in some areas, and that those areas that we're not making progress in, hopefully we will continue to invest in those opportunities and continue to try to make them successful as well in the overall reduction. So thank you very much for your time, and hopefully we'll see you in the next webinar.